Thank you, Tom and Jim and James, for being here. You will see we've got a nice new cozy boardroom table, which I'm sure you'll enjoy. We've decided that it is important that we are a little bit closer and look each other in the eyes a little bit better. So that's why we've set it up slightly differently. Thank you for being here. It is also your last time that you're going to be with us, Jim. So thank you. We're glad that you're here, and I'm sure you're going to join us tonight as well. So, Tom, we've had such a busy day. I'm not so sure where all my notes are for this session, but we had a really good prep session last week already, where we discussed what's on the agenda. What I'm going to do, I know I normally give you feedback from our prep session, but I think what I'm going to do this time around is rather let you go through your slides and talk to your slides and talk to the things that you have on your mind and that's keeping you awake at night. And then I'll give you the feedback from our discussion and I'll open it up after that. So let's give him a chance to first go through his presentation and then we circle back on comments and questions. Thank you, Tom.
Well, first of all, it's great to be here. What keeps me up at night seems to be all my travel these days. I was up, just got in from Brussels this morning on a 7 a.m. flight, which, as anyone you know, when you're traveling and you have an early flight, which means you wake up like at 2 to 3. But to give you a sense, we are busy right now, and we're actually in the midst of 2 simultaneous significant outreach trips. We have a team out in Asia, Oceania right now, and here in Europe doing outreach on 5,000. So, and I think that is a really sort of starting point, is that we're moving at a pretty breakneck pace for standard setting right now. And if you think about where the monitoring group reform started from, a lot of it was, can standard setters be sufficiently agile and responsive to the public interest? And that was a core part of our strategy this current go-around. So if you think of what we've done, and I know there's a few new board members here, is during this time period that I've been chair, which encompasses the current strategy, we approved our standard 315, we've approved the whole QM suites of standard, we've approved 600, we just approved our LCE standard, we're nearly there on the ED for fraud, and I'll mention that a little bit. Going concern has been out for public consultation. We've had our PI standard is submitted to you for approval. We're on way to move on PI track 2, and clearly we have all the sustainability work that's underway, and which I think we're progressing in rather quick order. So if you even think about our strategy process, some of the comments we've heard is, in fact, oh, now could you dial it back a little bit, allow the market to absorb all of the work that you do? And in many ways, I view what we're doing on strategy and work plan as a way to sort of catch our breath and assess what we need to do next to make sure we're thinking about things in a thoughtful, strategic manner. So it's not one issue by one issue, but addresses broader strategic questions facing audit and assurance marketplace. Also, that we're doing it in a way that supports the org structure that we want under the monitoring group reform. That means our move towards more of a staff-oriented model, and that we're doing so in such a way that the whole standard setting infrastructure talks appropriately to each other. Like, we're not doing this exercise in isolation. Clearly, we're working closely with IAASB, we're part of the same organization, but reported standards fit with audited assured standards that fit with ethics standards, and clearly it all works within a regulatory dynamic. And so that's really what drives a lot of our strategy discussion. And just to give you a sense of how we structured our strategy, and this is for those who have been with us for so long, is that we set up our strategy at a high-level goal, which is our aspiration, which is, as we see, the differentiated factor to make this organization a success. It has to be appropriately aspirational. Things that will determine whether we're successful or not are the challenges in the marketplace, the dynamics are called our strategic drivers. Strategic objectives are the things that respond to the opportunities and risks of the marketplace. They're the outcomes that will drive us towards our goal. And then we have a list of strategic actions that are ways we will achieve our strategic objectives, and that includes our work program. And I know everyone loves to jump to the work program, but it all connects to each other in a measurable way. Compared to this strategy that we have ongoing right now, in fact, I don't view this as fundamentally a transformational strategy. We're not switching directions. We don't feel our current strategy is flawed, but we're building on that. We're getting more specificity in a few areas, such as our outreach and our commitment to regulatory and standard setting connections. We focus on what we mean in terms of building a healthy organization, but we're really sort of taking our strategy today and going a step further. As you know, we've put out our strategy for public comment. One of the things that we wanted to make sure as part of the current strategy is that we had a much higher level of engagement and visibility with the organization. So compared to previous feedback on our strategy, we've had a lot broader sense of engagement globally, but also amongst stakeholder groups. In the past, it used to be the accounting firms and the member bodies that dominated this consultation, but you could see here that we have a broad range of input, which gives us some greater sense that our efforts to engage over the last few years are paying off. Clearly, we would like to do more as it relates to investor groups. And Sandy, we talked a little bit about this at the CAG meeting as well. But one of the things that has been pleasing is, and particularly this was highlighted also at our CAG meeting too, is that there seems to be broad support for the direction we're heading in our strategy, for our strategic objectives, for our goal, but with some desire to be a little bit more ambitious about the issue of technology, the value of post-implementation reviews, to give us a feedback loop for all the work that we've done, a desirability to balance the need for responsiveness with effective implementation, and a lot of discussion about how you prioritize different projects or one over the other. Jim, I don't know if I should pause here if you want to come in a little bit on CAG's feedback.
Well, part of the reaction, Tom, from the CAG was a little bit, if you think about a snake and you see this big body coming through, and those are all the standards that have recently gone through the IAASB, and now they're coming out for the profession, the world to use. And I think there was a sense from the CAG that it's an awful lot of change, consistent change. And we highlighted the importance of reflecting, if you had post-implementation reviews up there, reflecting on post-implementation reviews and the effectiveness. So were standards such as 315 or 540, where there have been a lot of changes, have they made those changes? Have those changes been affected in the way they were intended to be? And maybe it's time to do some searching and looking back at some of those. So that was a good part of the commentary from the CAG.
Thank you, Jim. So again, going back to our goal, I think when we set out in the current period, we really were focused on putting the public interest at the heart of everything we were doing, and not just for that sake, because it will engender greater trust in external reporting and therefore help markets and the economies work better. So that is very much part of our commitment, but then we're making some calls here. What do we need to be as an organization? So there's a concept of global acceptance. this is a big one here. We're not seeking a fragmented world, and we should be very focused on things that will lead to global acceptance and non-fragmentation of our standards. So like in the past is LCE, but clearly we're trying to get a globally accepted assurance standard. We want to make sure that global adoption of our audit standards remain. Second thing, we're making calls that we're focusing on audit and assurance in this strategy period. We can do lots of other things. There are other standards we've issued, but that's our focus for this period, and I think that's where we will continue to focus. And then the final thing, the third element is about evolution in a timely manner. So we need to remain responsive. We need to be attuned to the risk in the marketplace. And so that are the three distinguishing elements of our strategy. On this slide, as you know, the strategic drivers on the left, I'll assume they're red, but just to highlight, one of the things we've heard from a lot of our stakeholders, particularly the regulatory community, is you'd still need to remember your bread and butter. Audit matters. And so if you see, our number one strategic objective is continue to focus on audit standards. And we characterize this, at least 70% of our resources long-term need to be focused on in that area. At the same time, we need a dedicated stream for assurance standards. About 30% of our effort will be dedicated to that. In the near term, it's very much focused on getting the baseline standard at 5,000 complete, but that's going to remain a goal. We're going to keep that work stream. It'll be separated. That means you can guarantee enough resources at a time for both. The third one, and remember when our strategies, it doesn't mean it's everything we're doing, it's the things that we're emphasizing. So in this one, I referred to this earlier, it's our coordination with key standard setters, IAASB would be in the lead, but other leading standard setters and regulators, to make sure the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. I've always been concerned that if reporting standard setters do their thing, we do our thing, regulators do their thing, and we don't have any sense of integration or commonality, and we can't message in that way, then people are not going to understand the value of our work. The risk is that standard setting boards, reporting standard setters produce standards that aren't perfectly assurable. People forget the value of ethics, being the foundation to everything. So, for example, we continue to engage, in addition to all the work we're doing with IAASB, strong engagement with the IAASB and the IAASB. In fact, 2 weeks' time, I'll be down in Panama City with the IFRS Foundation to make sure that when they're promoting IFRS and IAASB's work, that they don't forget the value of assurance in the process. And then finally, it's about the way we work internally, the types of organization we want. Gabriella and I spent a lot of time with our board last week talking about culture. Culture is a really important element of what we're trying to do, in addition to have the necessary resources and people on site to make the transition as the monitoring group does. That will remain an organizational drive for both boards. And I'm glad Gabriella's in the room, but we work very closely on that. And we're trying to find things that not only attract talent, but also retain them and find this to be a really meaningful experience as a standard setter. Okay. So in terms of our work plan, that's a lot of the talk at our board and at the CAG focused on, and not surprisingly, because people want to see how this all works out and what will come next and how it will impact. Biggest thing is we have to work to the capacity that we have. I mean, right now, we're somewhat limited. We're also factoring in the element of when things come off, they could probably be replaced, but we don't have much incremental help. And under the new model, we want to create some redundancy on the staff to reduce some of the stresses going forward. So we could think about a board that runs about 5 to 7 projects that are happening concurrently, that we could start doing some new work beginning next year. LCE's coming off the agenda, and so we have some space. And then we have to think about all the other factors that we take into account when we think about projects. So we have to prioritize it based on maybe, is it a pervasive issue? Is it a major public interest issue? We use the PIF right now, obviously, to play that into account. And then we use our framework for activities about progressing projects through a research phase, to a scoping phase, to a project proposal phase. So where are we as a board right now? And there's a lot of discussion at our board meeting. And I sort of say that there's sort of three tracks that we got on. And part of it was that we were benefiting from the ED for 500, our audit evidence ED. And I would have to say that it wasn't roundly supported. It was, I think, people supported the general desire to deal with audit evidence, some of the general principles, but there were two comments that it either didn't go into enough sufficient detail to apply it consistently, or we were not ambitious enough as it relates to technology. The other thing I would say, and this is more by inference, is that it was hard to see how 500 impacts the other 500 series standards and also other performance requirements. So our thought process at the board was, on that track, is we should take a step back from 500, our audit evidence standard, and do it in a much more integrated way with ISO 330, which we knew had to get addressed because we did 315, which is the risk assessment standard. So the responses naturally come with it. And we should marry it with some philosophical approach on how we will address technological issues, because that will have an impact if we're going to really be thoughtful. And that's not necessarily to say we need to embed lots of technology in 500 or 330, but we should think about it before we move forward. And it may imply that we do something within analytical procedures as a standard, as a sample, as how you can marry this approach. So that was thought to be quite a significant project, and that would take a track of time. It would also allow us to be a little bit more strategic, but it would delay some time frames on 500. But that would be okay from what we're hearing in the marketplace, because people are saying, be appropriately ambitious. We're coping with a lot of new requirements, and come up with a better strategic approach to 500 with 330 and other performance requirements in our standard. And then that we heard another area, so that's sort of track one. That would take effectively 2-ish of the 5 to 7 slots, and that would be an immediate priority. Then there were other areas, particularly for regulators. We heard about the importance of ISO 320 materiality, and this has some interest too, because it has a cross-cutting element with sustainability assurance. We heard about ISRE 2410, but what I would say on that standard is that it wouldn't be a top priority for us, other than the fact that it's outdated, it hasn't been through the clarity process. We could potentially, going back to our idea of working with other national standard setters, work with one of them or more than one of them and have them help do the work for us up front, so we could prioritize other leading public interest issues. And then we need to continue to have capacity in our work program to do things with coordination with IAASB. So right now, it's going to be our track 2 of PIEs, but it could be external experts going forward or some other topic. But we need to continue to have capacity in our work program to do joint efforts with IAASB. And then doing post-implementation reviews. And we would imagine 540, our accounting estimates, would be the lead one to start, and others would then follow. So that gives you a sense of how we're thinking in terms of our audit priorities. And then as you get to sustainability, the biggest issues get done with 5,000. You need to finish 5,000 at time, and then the largest focus should be on supporting the adoption of 5,000 and implementation. After that, you need to figure out what you're going to do with 3,000, 3410, and the EAR guidance. And particularly, what people are asking us is update the EAR guidance along with other guidance you do and make it integrated to 5,000, and also clarify the role of 3410, which is greenhouse gas statement, which, in my mind, personal view, would fall into the 5,000 series ultimately. And then XBRL remains an issue for a number of jurisdictions. The board didn't take a position on that because they're so focused on sustainability right now. So that is our strategy work plan. Maybe I'll pause there. I'm sure you have comments. Certainly welcome your insights.
Okay, thank you. And I'll sort of just maybe mention one or two that came out of our preparation session. So thank you. It is also quite a heavy lift. There are lots of things and lots of important projects. And the presentation was quite useful to explain it to us. We made maybe two basic comments or overarching comments, and the one is just supporting and agreeing and, you know, recommending that you keep on integrating and talking to IAASB and the continuous coordination that is just really important, and you know it and you've acknowledged that, but we think that is quite important. The other one is just in these, let's call it trade-offs, and for example, we had the discussion a couple of times in this morning session, the whole aspect of internal controls came up, and you spoke about materiality and the thinking around audit evidence and so on. We think it's quite important that you're just transparent in your thinking and conclusion. So when you get the document out to say this is it now for the strategy and work plan, that there's insight and transparency, why this one is in, this one is out, this one is delayed, and probably very importantly with audit evidence, the reason and the thinking around having this holistic approach, or that's what you integrated approach, I think is what you called it, versus the standalone approach. So, you know, if that's the right decision and that's the decision, maybe just make sure, especially with audit evidence, because it is resulting in a delay, just the level of transparency being quite important. Those were sort of some of the comments that I made. I'm just going to check for more hands before we continue. Thanks, Philippe.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just sorry for that if I raise a question which was debated in the past. It's an innocent and candid question at the same time. In terms of contribution and responsibility for the PIOB, what is the process to ensure that we as PIOB board are informed of the comments in an exposure draft, duration, the comments related to public interest and with the origin of the comments, so that we can be reasonably sure that we don't miss something which would be enlightening, and at the same time, which would provide us something in terms of learning curve of the mood and reactions of the market to the evolutions. Is there any process of reporting of that from the standard setters to the PIOB?
Yes, I think there are quite a couple of belts and braces. I'm not sure that Claudia, maybe that's something that we want to discuss and just talk about a little bit more in our private session. I don't really want to use Tom's time for that, but there are quite a couple of processes. In the first instance, it's important that they see the comments and that they deal with it, but we have an additional layer where we look at comment letters, where we, spend time and look at board papers and so on. So the short answer is there are quite a few belts and braces processes, but I think it would be useful, maybe Claudia, that you just talk Philippe through the detail of it, because it is a very important aspect of our own processes. I agree with you. Janine?
Yes, thanks, Tom, for giving us the highlights again. Well, for me it is again, because I was, of course, at the meeting. But I want to build on what Linda was saying, because we pre-discussed this last week. And I personally think also for the integrated approach, there are, of course, implications. For instance, that the 500 will not see the daylight, most likely at the timing that it was previously anticipated. So there are also maybe some people, how do you say, disappointed maybe. Or on the other hand, the technology is what a lot of people want, I think, the IAASB to address. And so there's a lot of merit in the integrated approach. But I think it's also very important to highlight in the updated work plan what exactly the issues are, as far as you already know them, the public interest issues that you want to solve through the 330 and what you want to address additionally through the technology, and to include there also, put it central, the internal control. Because, well, at least I have raised, but we also in our PI issues, I think we also have that in writing. We often make comments as PIOB that we consider the internal control work the auditors need to do as very fundamental for the quality of the outcome of their work and whether there's sufficient support for the opinion and with the high level of assurance. And the 330 and also 500 then are also a lot about this internal control. And in the current standards, there's not really anything on what we, based on the standards, what is expected by the auditor that he should do as a minimum work effort on internal controls. That's not so clear through the requirements. And therefore, we see in practice inconsistent application often happening. Well, that's what regulators say, and that still is happening. So I would like to encourage you to also, in your work plan, make it clear, because I know that you have not put in the work plan going forward the more integrated approach to internal controls, but you can make it, like technology is something you need to put in, but it's the same with internal control, because it's not one single standard. It's the fraud standard, it's the 330, it's the 500. You also could take that on board at the same time, because it's the core of these standards, I think.
Okay, Tom, back to you.
So, thank you for those insights and the emphasis on the transparency of why we prioritize. I think we had a bit of that in the working paper for the board, but we'll clearly need to have some discussion of that when we get to our list of priorities or priorities at the moment. One of the things we won't, by the time we complete the strategy of work plan, we'll have a detailed assessment of all the issues, public interest and otherwise, on 500, 330 and technology, because we will run through our information and research gathering phase of that project. That will then lead to a project proposal, which is what gives the appropriate public interest articulation. Janine, entirely agree that part of the element of this is 330, which must deal with internal controls. In fact, right before this meeting, all the discussion, knowing that you had raised internal controls at our board meeting, I looked back at 315, which has quite a robust discussion of internal controls from a risk assessment standpoint. The issue is there's nothing that really matches yet on 330. That would clearly have to be part of our discussion. But if it would be helpful, in addition to emphasizing the role of technology in any public discussion, we could put it in because maybe people are looking for it. What I would say is we got a little confused at the board itself, because people were confused in the idea of us doing audit evidence and our response standard, and then my discussion about technology and it being integrated. It's not integrated because of technology. It's the integrated part's about 500 and 330 and the potential interplay with each other. Then the idea is, okay, we need to have a real strategic approach at the board as it relates to technology. And you know, I think there's, at this point, not huge consensus at the board about, oh, should standards still be operated at a high principle level and not be totally agnostic on technology, then you just do guidance. I don't find that particularly appealing, but there's other members of our board that do find that appealing. So we have to resolve that. But whatever philosophy we develop and whatever tools we want to use, whether it's in requirements or application material or IAPNs or some other form of guidance, we need that, and that will be an underlayer and would clearly be one of the public interest issues we would like to solve in doing 500, 330, and something, probably something else. To be determined. I don't know if it's going to be entirely determined by December when we have to publish this, but I think we have to give a clear signal to the marketplace. But if it's helpful for communication purposes to say that that necessarily has to address the topic of internal controls, then we certainly shall do it.
Okay, Tom, I think we can move on to fraud then.
Okay, on fraud, and really I'll open it up more for your comments and questions, because I think the key point was when we spoke last, we had a pretty robust ED ready to go. And I think the biggest public interest concern expressed by your board was they didn't want weakening of requirements going into the exposure draft phase, and that's been noted in your public interest issue list. And I would happy to report that I didn't see any backtracking, and indeed you sat through the meeting on this. There's a real commitment to the core elements of what we're trying to achieve in the standard, which is shown on this slide about clarifying the emphasis of the auditor's responsibility, improving communications throughout the audit with those charged with governance and management, applying a fraud lens as you're dealing with 315 and other standards throughout 240, improving the work effort when requirements fraud or suspected fraud are identified, and then a mechanism for external reporting. The one area that we did focus a lot at this meeting was on the application of professional skepticism. And, you know, I thought our discussion on the authenticity of documents and the assumption that documents are genuine all the time, and the language in their standard today, the extant, could give a sense that you almost always accept documents as genuine. We changed the language standard, and there was real support for that. In fact, I was one of the people who raised this issue. I feel like we're missing some bridging language there. It's not that all documents, you're doing a full assessment on every document that you ever receive, but where risk factors exist, you can't assume that they're genuine. And I think we're trying to change the tone rather than accept everything, that auditors have to start questioning user skepticism and point people in the right direction, both through requirements and our application material. So we spent a lot of time on areas about how we we highlight that. We made things more consistent with ISO 250, I believe, and I think people will think it's a pretty tough standard when it comes out. Some people will like it, some people won't. I know there's some discussion about, have we gone far enough on the transparency? Is CAMS the appropriate mechanism? Most people at CAG was pretty supportive of continuing to use CAMS. When we spoke to them, I don't remember, was it at this CAG meeting or the last?
We did talk about it there was a discussion on the CAMs in particular, and I think the sense is there needs to be something, there was some discussion about when you, in cases where you didn't have any instances of fraud and what kind of statement in the transparency was appropriate. So that was the feedback that, and I think that was reflected in my notes to the PIOB.
And on that one, you know, if I remember, the discussion was whether it lead to boilerplate. Now, I have a personal view that lots of times people use boilerplate as an excuse not to, the word boilerplate as an excuse not to disclose. Of course, some boilerplate in people's minds is just really standardized language. And many things we do is standardized language. And so if you have no significant risk identified, the statement of it is just a fact. And I personally like the statement, at least something that we should be tested in the ED, because it focuses attention. When you have to state something for the same reason you disclose the auditor's names, it focuses attention and it will change behavior. Now, there was some concern that it could lead to trivial CAMs and say what there was a fraud risk identified when it's not. And, you know, I think this is something we're willing to get comment on. This is why we're out there. But if you don't put it out for exposure, you can't have it in the final standard.
Yeah, thank you for that. And just as we're taking comments, maybe one or two comments from our session, we also noted and got the feedback that, you know, this is something that is really pushed forward, and we are in general comfortable with where you propose the ED to be. As you know, we felt all along that the transparency, ideally not in CAMs, but, you know, at least we have transparency now, especially when it comes to factual information. There were fraud indicators. We might or might not have found fraud, but there were fraud indicators. That's a factual statement, and certainly in some of the discussions that I've had with some of the bigger firms, when it's factual information, there's in a way also protection for them afterwards. We disclose that there were fraud indicators, and as an investor or as a user, you know, it's not as if it wasn't known to you. It links a little bit, especially to that internal control point as well. The other feedback that we also got was the really strong task force that really wanted to, as you said, push the standard forward. And I guess there's always a little bit of stress in the system to balance it a little bit. You spoke about the comment on authentic documents and the view on it and how you've pushed that forward. And I think those might sound like little tweaks, but all of those things actually add up to make it better. So hopefully we'll see this exposure draft. I think the plan is for it to come out in December.
In December.
So, and I agree with the notion, I think as a board we agree with the notion as well, that push it further as far as you can. You'll rather than if it's a practical reason or something that nobody thought about, and tone it down. But if you don't ask the question, nobody's going to put their hand up to do it.
No, that is the point, because if you go beyond the exposure draft,
Yes.
we have to re-expose. And this is a point on the 500
Yes.
document too. The timetable was going to slip. I think we would, if we just stuck with the current project, we're going to be headed towards re-exposure on that as well. I can't prejudge that outcome, but if you've listened to what we've heard, decided to be more ambitious to go beyond the existing project, you know, so that the timetables would be an issue there too.
Janine?
Actually, I wanted to say the same kind of things as Linda was saying, but I think because my feeling was there was a lot of good comments made, also to strengthen or make it clearer, also to apply really good the fraud lens. So that was all good, but I sensed also some reluctance or with some board members around this professional skepticism around the assumption that documents are genuine, because that has been out there for so long, and that's what they know. But I want to encourage you to make sure that it is improved in this ED when it goes out, so that might raise some discussion in December again. And to go for it, that it does something with the mindset, so that auditors need to be professionally skeptical to really consider whether documents and records are genuine or not. And that's a different starting point, and that's really key for this ED, I think. Thank you.
Thanks, Janine. Back to you, Tom.
Anything else on fraud?
Could I just ask a question, Linda, please?
Yes, sure. Sorry, I can't see your hand at the moment. Thanks, Robert.
Oh, my hand was up, yeah. Hello, Tom. I've got COVID, which is why I'm sitting in a hotel just around the corner from the meeting room, thanks to being in New York. James, I'm very pleased to see that you're there fit and well, given that we had a lot of contact last week. Thanks very much for the presentation on fraud. I'm pleased that this slide is up on the screen again. You partly answered my question, which was really going to be when is this going to be ready to put out into a due process? Because it's gone around the board now for another year, I think, since since we last discussed it in detail, and at some point it needs to go out obviously into a due process so that you get the comments back in a structured way. I understand what you've just said, which is that it's important to ensure that it is right to the point that you're not going to end up being shoehorned into having to re-expose something later. So certainly take that point. But if I can just make the observation from my perspective as a lawyer and as a governance practitioner and someone who knows a bit about auditing, I think the balance is pretty good on that slide that I can see right in front of me here. So I just wanted to ask you, Tom, is it getting to the point now where it will be ready? And do you have in mind, not asking you to recite them, but do you have in mind what the key questions are going to be that you're going to put to submitters and seek comment on? Thank you.
Thanks, Robert. Sorry to hear that you got COVID, but I hope you're feeling well. Your voice seems pretty good, so I hope it's not too serious. So
I was hoping actually to be there today, but I just had another positive test this morning. I should really be over it and possibly will be there tomorrow, but we'll wait and see.
Okay, so in terms of timetable, it's quite simple. We're approving in December. In reality, we could have possibly approved it in September, but we're also managing the board. We had a major approval for LCE, and that's a lot of stress to put the board under in terms of drafting that goes on in the final session. So we're approving it in December. It'll go out for a 120-day exposure period. And then, as you remember, we'll bring that in going concern sort of together, and they'll be finalized as they're not a package, but people wanted to make the changes simultaneously. So that's the plan. In terms of the major topics, well, I don't want to prejudge where our board lands on it, but I'm certainly that the transparency elements are going to be a key element. When we talk about the changes we made, for example, the one we just talked about documents and genuineness, things that are changes from extant are big ones. We've had a lot of discussion at the board over the last couple of meetings that were less, I think, substantive, but more drafted. But it was drafted in the fact of how does it link to other standards? Remember, we're trying to put just the fraud lens on existing requirements like 315. Have we gotten that balance right? I also think one of the things we did was about clarifying the role and responsibilities of the auditor in relation to fraud, and I'm sure that will engender a lot of comment. Remember, it used to be in the context of a negative, things that you can't expect an auditor to do, and we've tried to really start with the positive in that regard. So not the inherent limitations, but the actual responsibilities.
Okay, thanks, Tom.
Yeah, and I think that sorry, just a quick response on that, Linda. I think that's dead right what you just said, Tom. And the key to this is turning around that negative defensive response, which auditors always have had whenever the questions of fraud have been raised, to something that is getting the acceptance out there in the public interest that this has to be looked at positively. And so I think a huge amount of work has been done to achieve that, and I've always supported that not opening the standard up entirely for complete review and building on what's there, but turning that the narrative around in the other direction. So if you can achieve that through the ED, make that clear that you're not going to back off on that. You'll get responses from people who will say that fraud is not part of the auditor's role, and not part of the brand, and you have to continue to hear that, I guess. But it's the key thing is to say, well, this is going to change things. It's going to require some positive thinking, and the skepticism is very important. But then I'm sure you're right that by December the board will be able to identify those key matters that you really do want to put in the questions in the request for comment. Very positive. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert. Do you want to talk about 5,000? Oh, apologies, I've missed you, Sandy.
No, that's fine. I just put up my card. In the conversation there about discussing the differences from the extant literature, are you going to produce anything that is sort of more of a summary that shows what the differences are, sort of by section or overall, so that those who aren't steeped in all of the specific language can access it, and that there's an ability to show that the reasons that this project was taken up are addressed, for the public interest?
We will usually put up a bunch of it, like do a couple minute videos, explain the purpose of the project. All of that will come out when we release the exposure draft. So that's the plan.
Thanks, Tom. Want to do 5,000?
5,000. So, first of all, it's a miracle that this is the last topic of the conversation I've had. It seems like everywhere I go that this is the number one topic today. But as you know, we have, since we last met, published 5,000. IAASB 5,000, ED 5,000. It's out there. We've done a lot. If you've gone to our website, there's a lot of explanatory material about what we're trying to do, how we want to engage people. So from our standpoint, it's obviously important substantively to get feedback because it'll make the standard better, but also for the legitimacy of the standard that we're trying to make globally accepted. It needs to be publicly visible and seen how we're doing, and it has to be highly inclusive. So if you see the slide, this slide basically gives you the ways we're trying to improve understanding of our objectives, how we're trying to engage people throughout the process. So we've done a lot of webinars, outreach. I spoke to journalists, a webinar the other day that had 900 people on the call that's now available. We've had a couple thousand people on webinars. I was at the Accountancy Europe event yesterday, doing a lot of information sharing of that stuff. Meeting directly with specific groups, not just the practitioners, going far and wide on that. We're holding global roundtables and regional outreach events. Some that we're the primary host of, but when we're the primary host, we've partnered with IAASB on that. So at each of our IAASB events, we're working with a local securities regulator. So I'll be there with Jean-Paul in Brussels on Friday. In New York, during our board meeting, we had a roundtable. The SEC was very much part of it. Sadly, Paul Munter's flight got canceled, but we had IOSCO and SEC representatives at the table. We're having a an Asia roundtable in KL on October 10th. I'm going to Sao Paulo on the 1st of November, so we're making sure that we do both Northern Hemisphere and Southern Hemisphere. We have regional events where we're cooperating with either the local regulator or standard setter in Australia, South Africa, Toronto, Canada, and Tokyo. Tokyo is actually happening this week as well. That's with the Japan FSA. So a lot happening to make sure that we get people involved, particularly with a focus on non-traditional stakeholders in our world. So clearly we need accounting firms involved, but we need a large part, including non-accounting practitioners. And I've been pleased so far with the result. That's our approach to engagement. I could talk to you about some of the themes we're hearing already, early days, but maybe I could answer questions about our approach to outreach.
And we've noted in your report quite significant outreach, which is absolutely important and commendable. It's not easy to do all of that, but it is important, especially in this standard that is so new. So well done with that. Tom.
Thank you very much for the presentation. And I think that's one of the issues perhaps you would like to mention is concerning the value chain entity. And we are in the joint session, and I'm very pleased to hear that the joint value chain entity is a big issue for not only for the IAASB but IASB as well. So we are very pleased to hear that. The question I would like to ask is that the different thing is that the communication with the ISO communities, because I was in the IASB meeting, and IASB started to have a mapping exercise with the ISO community, and what is the difference concerning the ethics, and what is the difference of the independent status. That's what is happening between the ISO community and then IASB. I understand that the stage is very different between for IAASB because the EDs was out. But at the same time that I hear in the ISO community, they started the project called the Validation and Verification of Sustainability Information Project for the Part 1 and Part 2. It's called the ISO 14019. So they started their project for building their new standards. So I think that we need some sort of how can I say, not only the usual outreach, but a little bit more focused outreach with the ISO communities. Could you update a little bit what is happening between the IS community in particular?
So we're actively involved with the staff and secretariat, so much so that one of our the lead staff members is an active observer in the process. They have access to our materials. We don't have full access, broad access to theirs, but one of our staff members will have access to the work good papers. Ours, of course, are all available to the public. I think their intention is to work off our concepts, but I don't know all the details about how they intend to do it. One thing we heard at our New York roundtables was the desirability to have a single standard and not to have confusion in the marketplace, and that they urged commentators and stakeholders urged us as a board to potentially do guidance that would help to bridge existing concepts and other literature to our standards. So we've now considered doing the guidance simultaneously to our drafting of the standards. So concepts that are specific to ISE 3000 are now carried forward to 5000. would be more understandable to other practitioners. And so I think we have a couple of new staff resources that will assist us in that process. But very active engagement with ISO and accountability. My understanding is that they plan to follow our concepts and approaches. I'm not sure exactly how that plays out and the issues as it relates to intellectual property, but we're clearly there to work with them.
Thanks for that. James, do you want to come in?
Thank you. I pay particular attention to the developments with the ISO and the two standard setting boards, and maybe just for context why the ISO and IAASB initiative have proceeded at the time and the way they have versus IAASB. And you could always say the IAASB and auditing assurance standards are easier. We've learned in our dialogue with ISO that the way in which they address and the structure of their standards in dealing with ethics and independence and objectivity is a little more complicated within their suite and structuring of their standards. And secondly, I think there was an initial understanding of equivalence already from the start, and we felt, well, we're not too sure about that. So because of those two elements, our ability to understand and map to their structure, and to make sure that we're not making assumptions of equivalence, we've undertaken that exercise, which is a different space relative to their experience, understanding, and structures for the assurance standards. Thanks.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks, James. Janine.
Yes, thanks. Yeah, Tom, the roundtable in New York was very interesting. A lot of good input, I think, that you received, and I'm looking forward to all the other, consolidated outcomes from the roundtables, and of course the ED responses. But there's one topic that is still actually on top of my mind, and that was also being discussed in New York. That's about group sustainability information and group, assurance on a group level. And in particular, from the perspective of non-professional accountants, that other practitioners stepping into this assurance, sustainability assurance. Having also had discussions with them over lunch, they were saying we do a lot of this work already for aggregated group sustainability information, but they didn't know what was in our ISA 600. So I explained two main principles: the undivided responsibility for the group engagement leader in terms of an assurance engagement, and the concept of directions, supervision and review by the group engagement leader. Those two main fundamental principles from ISA 600, they don't apply, were not known, and therefore I discussed, or you told me before, and at the board when I was observing also, I raised the question, why nothing in this ED about group? You wanted to do that for later on in the, as a new separate standard in the suite of 5,000 standards. But I was still thinking these two overriding principles that are so fundamental, if you would have those in this standard, it's already clear for others that start using it, that are not professional accountants, that they need to do more than just what they always did, maybe based on other standards, when they are doing group sustainability information assurance, which will be the majority of the information that they will assure. So this is still on my mind, that it is an important thing. Thank you.
And if I recall, there was a flag or a question, or that the groups are specifically excluded. So it's going to be interesting, I would imagine, to see what comes out of the comments.
Not excluded, that
Not yet dealt with, yeah.
We don't deal with them in great details, but we do talk about consolidation of information. So remember, 6,600 is a special consideration standard, and it builds off of the other standards that we have. So, we expect to hear comment on it, and I'll reserve judgment till we hear comment about what our right response is.
Thanks, Tom. Mark?
Yeah, just on outreach and engagement. I mean, we saw from the consultation on the strategy that although the sort of the breadth of respondents was greater than before, still we only had, I think, 2 investors responding and no preparers as far as I could see. What is the level of engagement of investors and preparers in the outreach events that you're doing? And to what extent are you sort of reaching out to groups, either individual preparers, major companies, or representative groups like FEI, Business Europe, 100 Group, to engage and get them involved in providing you with some feedback?
So intentional at all these roundtables. I think we're targeting at least 3 or 4 from those groups at each of those roundtables. Currently, we also included civil society groups as well. So I think we're trying to get a balance of basically even proportions of different types of groups at each of the roundtables. I think we had 4 or 5 investors at the New York one, and then a couple of the preparers in the process.
I was just thinking it might be useful, I mean, Lindy, let me know if you think this is a sensible idea, if we actually just received a list of the people who'd attended these outreach events, so that we can sort of see that, yes, indeed, there has been a reasonable amount of participation and it's fairly wide.
And maybe something to share with I'm sure, Claudia, you look at that in any event, you've got an idea, yeah. So we've got that, we have access to that information. And I'm sure from your side, Tom, and your team, if there are obvious gaps in those outreach attempts when it comes to specific groups of stakeholders, that I know you do try to make sure that you cover them somewhere.
And our intent is to put all of that on the public record of who we've spoken to. I've even spoken to the team about if we're doing one-off engagements, we should have file notes that are publicly available. So again, going back to my first time, it's like, it's important that we get the substantive feedback, but we also want to give a sense more broadly that the substantive feedback is coming from a very broad range of stakeholder groups.
Okay. I just want to, yeah, you want to come in, Sandy, and then I want to circle back to Jim.
Yeah, I was looking for my notes from the CAG, and I couldn't find them quickly. And this is why I like paper rather than...
Sandy, you wanted to
Okay, I walked away from the CAG conversation about this standard, and that, it's a lot of work, it's headed in the right direction, but there's a lot of, what will the reports look like for investors? While the framework is, while the standard is framework agnostic related to the sustainability standards, the public interest is not framework agnostic, right? There are different public interests if you're following the IAASB versus the ESERS, so there's different things that we have to think about. I think the materiality project that was discussed as a part of the work plan is particularly important. And, my projection is that when we get to 2025, investors are going to have a big step back moment and say, what does this all mean, right? And that there's a lot of work there will be a lot of work even after that as a part of the work plan, that we need to think about. I think there was 1 or 2 other things, but I can't do them off the top of my head. But what this all looks like on the other end from a user perspective is going to be very interesting. And I'm not sure, even if they are participating in these roundtables, which I think is, your point is really well made, that I think that the penny's going to drop a little bit later than maybe we like. I mean, but that's just the normal state of play, right?
part of the journey in a way with something that new.
Absolutely, absolutely. My colleagues were saying, oh, well, the sustainability information is like taken care of. And I'm like, no, you don't understand. We're like right at the beginning of the journey, right? And I think this is just part of it. So anyway, just some observations from my listening in.
Jim, just back to you. Any other feedback from the CAG that you want to flag to us?
I think in the area of sustainability, the two issues that resonated with me, one was, and this is a old topic, but I'll bring it up, is you have reasonable assurance and you have limited assurance. And it's more in the sense of the public interest and what they believe reasonable assurance actually is. And so there has been talk about, well, a lot of these reports have to start at reasonable assurance and then build up over time. But there should be some neon box that makes it clear that what exactly limited assurance involves. And then the second area where there was considerable discussion was in the area of, well, it sort of falls under IAASB to some degree, but in the area of practitioners. And practitioners who do not have, let's say, the IPA background, and making sure that they have a system of quality control that is equivalent. There was some discussion by some of the CAG members said, well, what if they hadn't been practiced for a number of years, but they didn't have a rigorous system of quality control? It might take them a while to get to that point. And the other side of that is, well, they need to have that in place in order to work on those reports, especially those associated with numbers or with the financial numbers. I think those were two areas where they're old issues, but they came up again at the CAG meeting.
Thanks, Jim. And those are important issues, but as you say, they are in the mix. I want to go to James, and I give the last word to Tom. Anything else from your side, James?
No, thank you very much. I would maybe just comment that as we move into exposure drafts, and I think Robert had a good question thinking about the type of evidence that we need on exposure, especially in areas where, as you said, the key matters for discussion. It's where we've had to make choices, balances, and we're looking for evidence in terms of finding a right position. I'd just note more questions is not better in a standard such as fraud. I like Sandra's point that communication, what's changing, what's happening, what are you proposing is really the number one message. And then I think looking for where we want additional evidence on our position. But asking questions on every point that we made a decision on, I think, can undermine, I think, what you were saying. Be confident that this is a product. We're not doubtful of it. The positions, we need further information to make final decisions. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Tom.
So the one thing I want to end with is going back to what you always ask me, what keeps me up at night. Well, in truth, it's the standard setting side is not the thing that keeps me up at night. I feel like we have a really good board that has a good mix of people and that we're on the right track. Our strategy, our work plan puts us on this. The thing that keeps me up at night most is making sure that we fulfill what is now our fourth strategic objective in our proposed plan. And it's about building the type of organization that we want with the right people, the mix of people, the culture we want that's engaged with people. I view, this is why I started off saying that the strategy, work plan, and everything fits together. This integrated project actually gives us an opportunity to start moving to a staff-driven model in a strategic way. There's a reason that I don't want to just continue down the current path. Two, most of it is technical, but a lot of it is about organizational change. And this is the type of meaty project that you could get technical staff really engaged on and interested in and excited about. And so I very much have that model in mind. And so, first of all, I wanted to highlight that. But second of all, if you know good people who are interested in Sanderson, we are still hiring. Like, we are looking for good people. So please send them our way. So thank you very much.
As long as you don't take our people, that's all good.
Our people and your people, we're one organization, as I say.
Just leave Claudia alone. Thank you very much. Thank you for the documents. Thank you for the discussion. It was really useful, and it's really encouraging to see where you are with all of this. A couple of really big things in the pipeline, a couple of really big things out there for comment. So we will just encourage you to keep on going. We know it is tough for the staff as well, and they work really hard. We feel it on our side. You know, when we have a staff member that's not in the office, we're on 50%. So at the moment, that's where we're running, and we do see those reams of documents coming through. So we know on your side it's also very busy. Thank you. We will see you a little bit later at our cocktail function. And thank you to all of the board members. This is the end of day 2. Day 1 was our prep session. Thank you all for your participation. You can hang around, or else we'll see each other a little bit later for the cocktail function. And tomorrow we continue. So thank you.